Good evening and welcome to News Review. The convent confirmed on Thursday that there had been an unlawful incursion into British Gibraltar territorial waters by a Guardia Civil vessel. The Rio Sardena crossed in front of the nuclear submarine HMS Torbay as it was leaving Gibraltar.
The incursion took place this morning, with eyewitness accounts reporting that the Rio Sardena's crossing caused HMS Torbay to slow its speed, with the Royal Navy then challenging the vessel, which left British waters. A convent spokesperson said the UK government will be protesting the unlawful incursion with Spain, on the grounds that the Guardia Civil's actions are a violation of British sovereignty and a breach of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The statement makes no reference to the Rio Sardena's crossing in front of the submarine. A similar incident in August last year saw the Guardia Civil's Rio Tormes come very near the nuclear submarine HMS Talent, behaving in what was then described by the Foreign Office as a dangerous manner, causing considerable risk and danger. The convent has reiterated the Foreign Office view that unlawful incursions by Spanish state vessels do not weaken or undermine the international legal basis for UK sovereignty over British Gibraltar territorial waters.
The Gibraltar government this week said Spain was holding the whole of Europe to ransom in order to advance its claim on Gibraltar. This followed the Spanish foreign minister stating that Britain and Spain should seek joint use of the airport. José Manuel García Margallo said Spain could not accept EU laws being applied to an airport built on disputed land. Number 6 said this was contrary to the 2006 Córdoba Agreement.
José Manuel García Margallo said Spain would not recognise British sovereignty over the isthmus, adding Spain is ready to seek a solution based on the joint use of the airport. According to reports in the Spanish press, Mr. Margallo made the proposals at a meeting of foreign affairs ministers from EU states in Latvia. The meeting's main focus was a crisis in Ukraine and the civil war in Libya. Mr. Margallo said he had spoken with his British counterpart, Philip Hammond, who he says expressed the UK's point of view on the issue of Gibraltar. In reaction, the Gibraltar government says Spain should be made to honour its obligations under the EU treaties and the agreements they signed in Córdoba in 2006. It says any bilateral agreement seeking to suspend or exclude Gibraltar from EU aviation legislation would be contrary to EU treaties. Deputy Chief Minister Joseph Garcia says the very fact that Mr. Margallo mentions the isthmus and its legal status shows that all Spain is doing is advancing its sovereignty claim. He says Spain therefore is holding the whole of Europe to ransom in order to advance its claim to Gibraltar.
And the Gibraltar government said it was confident that the exclusion or suspension of Gibraltar from EU law was illegal based on advice it's received to that effect. This was in relation to the latest statements made by the Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel García Margallo, stating that Britain and Spain should seek joint use of the airport.
The government says that not only this administration but previous have taken a position totally contrary to the 1987 airport agreement, a policy that Mr. Margallo is now pursuing. The Spanish Foreign Minister has said Spain could not accept EU laws being applied to an airport built on disputed land.
How can the application of EU law be suspended to a part of the European Union where EU law applies? Look, we have certain derogations in our membership of the European Union. We don't belong to the Common Agricultural Policy, we don't belong to the Customs Union, for example. But we do belong to aviation matters, and aviation law applies to Gibraltar, and it should apply as of right. That is the position of the government. We don't believe in bilateral deals.
Mr. Margallo says that for him, this is primarily about sovereignty. But the government has emphasised that it has the UK government's guarantee that they will not enter into discussion on sovereignty without Gibraltar's consent.
We are confident that the exclusion or suspension of Gibraltar from EU law is illegal. That is certainly against the treaties, and we have advice already to that effect. Now, we need to wait and see what happens. Obviously, if we are excluded, then these are options which can be explored further and indeed which can be exercised. We know Spain is now objecting to our inclusion in EU civil aviation legislation. They had committed in writing not to do that. Spain has also reneged on a number of pledges made under Córdoba. One of them, the latest ones, was the Instituto Cervantes. But really the airport and EU law is fundamental to us, because we cannot accept a position whereby EU law applies to the whole of the European Union and where Gibraltar Airport is left out. In other words, a position where if you are an EU national flying from Malaga or from Heathrow or from Brussels Airport, you have more rights than if you are a new national flying from Gibraltar Airport. That is totally unacceptable, and it runs against everything that Europe is about. And in our view, that is the line and the position that the European Commission should take. The issue of sovereignty is a matter over which the Commission has no competence.
The Royal Gibraltar Police this week said it did not shirk its obligations under the Nature Protection Act and asserted that it did take executive action in respect of illegal fishing in British Gibraltar territorial waters. This followed an accusation by the Federation of Sea Anglers that the RGP turned a blind eye to the activities of Spanish fishermen and that it is tarnishing the reputation of the force.
Last week, the GFSA issued a hard-hitting statement laying the blame for the continuing infringements of the Nature Protection Act by Spanish fishermen squarely on the RGP's shoulders. The association's president, Mario Ramos, complained that whereas local anglers are routinely asked to show their license and prove they haven't caught undersized fish, Spanish fishermen are getting away with putting down nets just meters off the shore. Arising from the Federation's statement, GBC submitted a series of questions to the police. Its response is that its stance on the policing of British Gibraltar territorial waters has not changed. This, as previously explained by the Commissioner, Eddie Jomi, is to help the government arrive at a sustainable, scientifically based solution for the protection of fish stocks, and the RGP sees no reason to adopt a different posture. The RGP says it understands and respects that certain sectors object strenuously to the RGP's policy in this matter. However, it asks them to also understand that the police has a duty towards the wider community, which is possibly not as exercised on this issue as they are. It denies the GFSA's accusation that it's doing nothing to stop Spanish fishermen, claiming it challenges them virtually on a daily basis and asks them to retrieve their nets and leave local waters. The RGP points out that executive action need not necessarily mean arresting the fishermen and confiscating their boats, and that the form the action takes will depend on the circumstances of each particular case. The police restates its support for the wildlife wardens who enforce the marine protection regulations, and says it's willing to meet with individuals or representative organizations who wish to discuss this matter further.
The government company Gibraltar Residential Properties Limited is being sued for £27 million by the liquidator of one of the companies initially contracted to build waterport terraces. The government said this was the second such set of proceedings it's been served within a week relating to the Gst Administration. In a reaction, the opposition described the claim as spurious and without merit, and accused the government of trying to make party political capital out of it.
The claimant is the liquidator of a subsidiary company to Bruesa, with the claim issued in a Madrid court. The government and GRP have instructed the local law firm Trieste Nieto Niche, who have in turn instructed lawyers in London and Madrid to deal with aspects of the case. In a statement, the government says this is the second such set of proceedings it's been served with within a week, referring to the £8 million claim by the liquidator of the OEM group of companies. Chief Minister Fabian Picardo adds that his government will also vigorously defend these proceedings and work with the directors of GRP towards that end. But the GSD says Gibraltar has already defended itself successfully from the Bruesa claim in London, and describes the claim as frivolous, vexatious and entirely without merit. It says this is the second time in a week where the Chief Minister has attempted to make political capital out of legal claims made against Gibraltar. The opposition says the fact that the Spanish company is now trying it out with the Spanish courts does not justify the Chief Minister's attempt to convey the impression that the GSD's conduct led to the claims being brought against Gibraltar.
Also this week, Number 6 said the GSD is misleading people when it says the £27 million Bruessa legal claim had already been dealt with in London. It said the matter was struck out on a jurisdictional issue, but could very well be heard by the Spanish courts. Meanwhile, the opposition said the way the government is issuing press releases on these legal claims contrasts sharply with the way they clam up in Parliament when asked about court cases, for example with the Peter Salvenia issue. Jonathan Sacramento spoke to opposition leader Daniel Feetham, but first to the Chief Minister.
Well, it must be a different opposition to the one that was in government in 1996 and was constantly making party political points about the claims that were brought by the GSLP and continued by the GSD in relation to harbour views. They spent, in fact, not just the first few years after their election, they spent 16 whole years blaming the GSLP government for the problems at Harbour Views, whilst in litigation saying that the problems were brought about not by the Gibraltar government, who was the claimant there, but by the contractor. So, look, either they think that what they did in relation to the GSLP and Harbour Views was completely wrong, and Daniel Feetham now wants to decry those actions by the GSLP in government and previously in opposition, or what we're doing is absolutely appropriate, absolutely the right thing to do, and showing people that far from having inherited a golden legacy from the GSD, what we have inherited is a rotten legacy of only £2 million left in the kitty by the end of the last financial year of usable cash reserve than when we were elected, and over £100 million of claims that we're having to deal with, a rotten legacy, but despite which we are delivering entirely on our manifesto commitments.
Well, Mr. Picard is incapable of putting Gibraltar first, above his own narrow political interests. It's not the first time that he's done it. He did it last week in respect of a claim by the liquidator of OEM against the government, where he described the claim as a consequence of the GSD's rotten legacy. Well, look, implicit in that statement must mean that you believe that the Gibraltar government, the GSD government, did something wrong, which is a remarkably reckless statement for him to make, given the fact that this is something that is going to be litigated in the courts. Now, Mr. Picard well knows that this claim now by the subsidiary Bruessa is a try-on. This has been litigated before. It was litigated in the High Court in London, whereby GRP, the government-owned company, actually won against this particular subsidiary, and now it's trying it on via its liquidator in Madrid. Look, I have every single faith in the Gst Administration and the way that it conducted these particular contracts. And indeed, the only other litigation that has actually been concluded, although now it's subject to an appeal, has been the OHL litigation in respect of the tunnel under the runway, where the government was entirely successful. And it was entirely successful because of the scrupulous way in which the Gst Administration handled that particular contract and contractual relations with OHL.
And the government responded, saying the simple inaugural fact is that Gibraltar is facing 2 separate lawsuits totaling claims of over £34 million in relation to housing projects commissioned by the previous administration. The government said it has an obligation to contest these claims and accuses the opposition of being hypersensitive. And we'll be back with more of this week's news after this break.